My special friend is back. All right. Okay. Thanks for having this conversation with me, Joe. Um,
No, you're cool.
yeah, yeah.
Are you good?
So, we were talking about a desire, and I want to first of all, I want to make sure that you got out all the parts because I think this is a really expansive conversation, and especially on the panel, there's only so much you can do in a allotted amount of time. So let's start with this. Was there anything there that you wanted to touch upon that wasn't touched upon?
No, I mean, I actually was really proud of that conversation because I think a lot of the time when we talk about sex, which is something that I am talking about politically, we very quickly descend into personal experiences with sex, which I don't think is always useful because it's great at articulating your experiences with sex, but how we treat it as a society, it's informative without necessarily being. It's not something you can universalize in any meaningful way. So I actually thought we did a really good job, and I enjoyed the conversation a lot. And to be honest, I liked the fact that it returned to consent and trauma because I felt like it made the point. It made the point that because of the limited language we have to talk about desire and women's desire, we do default back to that issue. And you know what? Even though I snapped back quite hard at her, I think Josie does have a point. Part of the reason that we continually revert back to that is because women's safety is precarious. And so it is the first thing that comes to women's mind. But my question would be, one, how, and I say this knowing the answer slightly already, how important is, like, not how important, how omnipresent is the threat to the point that it should totalize the entire discourse, right? Women's safety. And the thing that I'm always conscious of, and I know it's a controversial point, but it's like when we talk about women's sexual safety constantly, are we reifying the idea of women's sexual purity being the most important thing? Noting that, of course, a consensual sexual activity is very different to a non-consensual sexual activity. And there is a clear distinction there. But I think the issue is that a lot of the time when men get upset about sexual violation of women, it's because there's still that idea of like women belonging to them and women needing to be sexually pure for their one partner. And sometimes I think we can actually traumatize women further by constantly hitting on how traumatic this experience is, how it is the worst thing ever. Because as I say, there's not the language, right? There are extremely horrific instances of violent, horrific rape. Then there's sexual assault, which can be horrific and terrible, and it can be something that is quite possible to recover from, right? And there's no nuance in that language. So we basically have sexual assault as an umbrella term for something that is something that you can handle and deal with, maybe even without therapy, and something that is used as a crime of war. So like we don't have any language even within sexual assault, and then past that talking about just normal sex that isn't a violation or assaultive, we have no language to talk about what wasn't a great experience.
Agreed. And it's not a spectrum; it's a binary, right? Whether there was consent or there wasn't consent. Was it something that's within the bounds of what we understand as legal, and what is outside? And anything that's outside is definitely was the worst thing that ever happened to you, right? Are you okay? Can we put you in therapy? Rather than.
And I mean, like, this is, as you said, it's this binary of consent, no consent. This is what we were talking about on my stream yesterday. It creates the ability for workarounds. If you say as a boundary, like, I don't want to have, this is the case that we were looking at yesterday. A woman said, I don't consent. I don't want to have sex without a condom ever. Like, that's my boundary. That's fine. The first time she and this guy have sex, he puts on a condom. She sees it. The next morning in the rush of the moment, he rolls over, they have sex. He doesn't have a condom on. he goes to, in the court of law, when she takes him to court saying, look, this was not okay, he says, well, she didn't explicitly say that that was something that was important to her before that sexual encounter. So consent, sure, he didn't, like, she didn't say no to that in that explicit encounter. So consent isn't a great framework for that. If we were using frameworks like respecting someone's boundaries, right? Respecting the autonomy of another human being and their rights, then you know very well that when she said at the beginning of their interaction, days before they had sex, I don't have sex without a condom, it doesn't matter if you have consent or not, you have disrespected that person. I don't necessarily think, I mean, I'm using a legal case because it was a legal case. I don't think all of this should be legislated or dealt with therapists. But what I'm saying is, like, there's a huge difference when we try and use consent as the only framework through which to see sex. Then we create loopholes, and we're trying to make it do too much. You're never going to get pleasure and enjoyment from consent alone.
Yeah, so understand. Okay, yes, and that goes back to what you were saying before, that consent isn't sexy, at least not within itself, right? Is that's not the focus of the pleasure. Rather, it's simply the ground rules of any. I don't want to use the term now, but any. I was going to say healthy. Any sexual interaction. Any proper interaction. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't use that either. Okay, great.
No, that's, I mean, like, it's respectful, isn't it? It's like, what do we owe one another? Like, what's part of the social contract? What are we doing when we interact with one another? You know, what do we owe one another? It's thinking about it in terms of reciprocity and respect, and the fact that you're engaging with someone who's an individual, autonomous human being who has wants and needs and desires of their own. And I just want to, like, quickly respond to some stuff that I'm seeing in chat. Axiom, I very specifically said that I don't think that legal recourse. I think often creating legal situations for social interactions creates more harm than good. I think consent is very necessary for some of those. For sexual assault, I think consent is necessary, but I'm not talking about convicting someone because they're disrespectful. I'm talking about how we talk about things in a social sphere, and the fact that the legal sphere and the social sphere loop and create norms. And in terms of the toxic take that brothers, fathers, partners care about women's lives and safety because you think that you own them, I'm not saying that's the only reason you care about it. I'm not even saying it's the explicit reason that you care about it. I'm saying there is a chance that socially there is a heavy weight put on women's sexual purity because of a history of that being something that was important to women who were owned by their fathers, brothers, husbands, whatever.
Yeah. And like, okay. So working it within the bounds of something that, of course, is consensual, right? So, like, taking it as the default, right? What you're talking about is taking the next step. Okay, so we've established this, right? Within that bounds, there is a wide array of experiences that a person can have, right? And I guess you can judge each sexual experiences on a number of different criteria, right? A part of that is pleasure. Part of that is communication, right? Like, did you feel heard by your partner, right? You can, like, so you can feel pleasure by something, but then feel like you weren't heard in the interaction, right? What else? I'm sure there's other things I'm not thinking off the top of my head.
Well, I mean, I think what you're doing is interesting, right? You're doing a conceptual analysis of good sex. What does it mean to have good sex? And this is even the point I was bringing up with the issue of pathologizing. And I was talking to Amanda about this just before. When the DSM says that if men don't come in a sexual interaction, that is sexual dysfunction, that is invalidating a lot of good sex. That is treating men's sexual experience as purely related to orgasm. So it is, once again, reifying a normative idea about what sex should be, when actually there's a lot of good sex that you and I could, like, work out and determine that doesn't involve that at all. And it's like some of the other women were saying on the panel about penetration being the main form of sex because that's how it has normatively been viewed. And when we actually think about what is good sex, there are lots of things outside of that we would include. So I think this is why I say that I recoil when I hear things that relate to the legal field, things that relate to the health field, and things that relate to a moral field, because ultimately those things are looking to enshrine an idea of normative sex that isn't necessarily the best. And look at areas like BDSM and kink, which you don't even have to participate in. If you look at them from the outside, you'll see that they do a great job at creating strong environments for like good encounters, like ideas like aftercare and communication and boundaries.
Yeah. So, okay. So, touching on that healthy thing for a moment, then, because there was clearly a hard disconnect that we had, and it took me by surprise. But I think it's maybe. I wasn't maybe. I'll assume that I wasn't using the proper language or something to properly express what I wanted to, right? But so outside of the bounds of legality, right? And understanding what you said before is true, that the courtroom informs real life, one or the other. Are there not ways that are ways that people express their desire, right, within society, right? That can be an spectrum in terms of like whether it's detrimental or beneficial or at least neutral. Do you think do you think that's not something that's worth examining? That's why I was
Of
trying
course.
to. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, there are grounds for social interactions, right, which are normative, okay? But I think trying to create absolute rules about social interactions is always doomed to failure because it will, in its essence, be normative, right? So what I was trying to say, and I'm so sorry, I realized after reflecting, maybe it came across like I was invalidating your experience, and that's not what I was trying to do at all. And it's why I actually really try to shy away from people expressing their experiences when they talk about this issue, because it's very hard to talk about things in a political sense when you're talking about your own issue without people feeling some kind of way.
I didn't feel, and I'll put out there. I didn't feel like you were invalidating. I would never think that about you, Joe. It's just we were having a disagreement, and we were just trying to find ways to match up what our thoughts were. So go ahead.
I think my issue is, right, if you took your situation and you put in different and you tried to just take the action, right? And you created different actors and a different environment with a different set of circumstances, that action that occurred may no longer be improper because the participants may want it. The circumstances coming up to it may be that there was like flirtation, the environment may be a bedroom. So it is. And then if you add in the actors or the environment or the circumstances, you're getting to the point of specificity where the rule is useless. So it can't be universalized because ultimately that rule, like let's say, never ever touch someone without consent, right? And it's hard for me to speak because I don't necessarily want you to go into the specifics of your situation, but at the same time, like I don't want to,
Ignore
but
my
what I'm saying is,
situation. Ignore it.
let's say someone. There are two friends, one of them has feelings, the other does not. The person with feelings touches the other person in a sexual way. The person who does not have feelings says, no, I'm not comfortable with that. If we then legislate or create normative rules, I mean, we already have normative rules around this, but like, let's say we legislate that if you touch someone without their consent in a sexual manner, that is a crime. What you're ultimately doing is saying good sex is sex that every single action is consensual in every circumstance, right? Because you're saying touching someone, always, before you even touch them, you need to have verbal consent. And what you're doing, and I've talked with you about this before, and I mean, someone's made a good point before that it's complicated by neurodivergency for a lot of people, but what you're doing is, one, you're putting women in a managerial position where, because most often they're the ones being hit on or touched first, or the movie's being made on them. So you're putting them in a position where instead of just enjoying the experience, they're saying, yep, the whole way through and managing the experience. And two, there are genuinely women who enjoy surprise, enjoy danger. Carol Vance wrote the piece on the pleasure danger continuum. As we know, there are people who take part in consensual non-consent. There are people who I don't like being catcalled, and I think it's a stain on society. There are women who really like that. There are women who like having their ass grabbed in the workplace and get off on that. I think that should be completely outlawed. But it's what you're doing is you're actually trying to create rules around what women are allowed to sexually desire and what people are allowed to sexually desire. You're saying this is good sex and this is bad sex.
Okay, friend, I think this is where we split, because I think you layered on the word healthy. You layered a lot of things on that I wasn't actually implying, right? So, for instance,
well, then don't use the word.
Okay.
Semantics.
I need to know. Oh, I need to know what are your trigger words. How would I have known that the word healthy is a trigger word for you? Sorry.
I told you anything relating to
after the fact,
health or morality,
after
legality, morality, pathology.
After the fact. Okay. Any which way. Which is another direction we could go to. But okay. So I wasn't trying to create some absolute rule. Right? Like, let's take sex out of it for a moment, and I hate to do that, but let's try it just for a second. Let's take sex out of it. And any social interaction is the exact same thing, right? Like, if we ignore the sexual aspect, then any interaction between two or more individuals, depending on the context, depending on the participants, right? Depending on the setting, can be viewed very differently. Can be viewed as appropriate or inappropriate, right? Can be viewed as legal or illegal. Can be viewed in all kinds of ways. I understand that. I get that, right? But in all other aspects in our life, right, we get that kind of training, right? Like, we're socialized, whether through school or through work, or as you just grow up in life, you are socialized as to what these things should look like and what you want yourself, right? How to express yourself in any given setting, right? And to be able to, even if you're expressing yourself in a way that's undesired by others, right? You'll at least understand what might be the consequences of those things. So, putting sex back into it and relating it to what we were talking about before, if women don't have the opportunity to express their sexuality, right, that is being suppressed, then when do you get the training to understand all these things, right, and how they interact in a myriad of ways, right? Like, does that make more sense? Like, I'm not looking for a hard and fast rule. I'm just saying that that there might be a deeper understanding of what sexuality for all genders can look like if we had those discussions, we had those honest discussions, if everyone was more free to express themselves, and that way, even men too, right? Because I think men in some ways are also limited, and the type of sexuality that is acceptable, right? Like I'm supposed to like women, right, and want to put various body parts inside of them, but beyond that, right, I think the conversation about like men's sexuality is very, very shallow, right?
And I think the conversation about sex generally is very shallow. That's my point. Like, when I say bad sex is a feminist issue, it's because it is sex fundamentally relates to women's rights and women's equality and in all sorts of ways. But sex as an issue is not just an issue for women. A feminist issue isn't just an issue for women, and creating more equality in sex will affect men too. I never say that. I say that women aren't good at, like, women don't have the ability to express sexual desire, right? And to talk about their sexual desire, and that hasn't been liberated, whereas sexual expression has been liberated for women. They're allowed to look sexy. They're allowed to be sexualized. They're allowed to post photos in bikinis on Instagram. That's fine. But if you were like, I don't know, damn, I'm so fucking horny tonight, that would be like a huge fucking deal. So, but that's the relation to women. Bad sex generally is language that none of us have to speak about. Sex that isn't assaultative, or I don't even know if assaultative is a word, sex that isn't like a violation and an assault the binary or sex that is incredible. There's nothing for that in between. And that's important because all this socialization that you're talking about, learning how to make sex better, that is where all of that occurs in bad experiences, right? They're not something we're going to eliminate. We can create a better sexual situation for women through allowing for the liberation of sexual desire, partly through liberating women's desire not to have sex, and respecting the fact that they don't want to have sex. I think was it Marcy or Josie who was talking about the fact that you've got asexual all the way through to hypersexual, like also respecting the fact that a woman can just not want sex and that's fine, and not something that should be like pathologized or moralized, or, you know, like a woman can say no. That is part of also liberating women's sexual desire, the desire not to have sex. And I think that's probably the easiest place to start, even though it feels like with all the liberation of sexual expression and wet ass pussy and all that shit, that it would be the other end. I truly believe that you don't get there without first totally normalizing a woman saying, I don't want to have sex with you, instead of saying, I have a headache or some shit. So yeah, I think the lacking of language for, and like, to be honest, we're talking about sex, I prefer to use the word fucking because I think it is more emblematic of like the actual act itself. I think it's better language for the act. And a lot of people in this area refer to it as fucking, but that language is something that we need across the board.
Okay. Okay, got so many places to take this, but I don't want to take too long because I don't want to take too much of your time. But first of all, going back to our previous conversation, do you understand like where I was trying to go with this? Like after taking some time to explain, does that make sense to you? Just before we move on.
Yes, Prime, we're good.
Oh look, I don't like it when we have disagreements like this. Well, whatever. Okay, look, leave me alone. I just all right. So, but I love what you said about you know, normalizing not having sex, right? Looking at like media representation of the like aggrieved wife, right? Who doesn't want to have sex with her husband, right? Like this is like the classic sitcom situation, right? She doesn't want to have sex with her husband, and it's always like framed, interestingly enough, right? I guess through his desire, like he wants something and she's not giving to him, and it's like never really it's very rarely explored as to like why, right? It's just like, it's a funny situation when he really wants to have sex and she doesn't, and like, hey, well, why does she never seem to want to have sex with this guy? This is I think like an important thing to talk about. Like, maybe you guys have different different like libidos, right? Maybe it's you're not helping out like with the house, right? Because in these situations, there's always kids.
Or maybe
right?
she just doesn't feel like it.
Yeah,
that's what I mean. Like you don't need a reason. Like it doesn't need to be a libido, a pathologized thing. It doesn't need to be some emotional thing of like, I'm withholding sex from you because sex is something that you have a right to, and this is my way of punishing you. Maybe she is an individual human being who, in that moment, doesn't want to have sex.
No, I agreed. But that's not all just okay, sure.
Of course, there are other instances where there are explanations. But what I'm saying is, until you liberate a woman's ability to not want sex without there being some fucking reason, then you don't liberate women's sexual desire. Like sometimes people just, and that's true of men too. Sometimes men just do not feel like having sex.
That is absolutely the case. So, talking about like the wider array of experiences, right? And I brought up like you know, you saying that thing about like not wanting to pathologize things after I said the word, you know, healthier, right? And relating that back to a sexual experience, right? Like understanding that like what is to be said when an interaction does happen. And we talked about this before. An interaction does happen, and afterwards you're like, okay, that wasn't cool, right? Like I didn't want like this. I didn't get a chance to relate this to you. Like we didn't have time to sit down and write down our wants and our do's and don'ts and our maybes. Like we didn't do all that. But this happened, right? And if you relate that experience to someone else, okay, I had this sexual interaction, and the thing that we've talked about before is choking. So we'll go that again, right? Like, a person choked me. I didn't want that, but I didn't relate that to them. Afterwards, we talked about it, and it was okay. But if we only have the language of assault, right, then that's what it'll be viewed as, right? Like, okay, this person did something you did not consent to it. You didn't previously, I didn't ask in the moment. Hey, it's okay. Can I put my hands on your neck? Go ahead.
And I think this is interesting, right? Because and I want to make it clear for chat and viewers that we're not talking about clear cut, huge traumatic instances of rape and sexual assault, right? We're talking about the fuzzy edge, and this happens all the time. I've used this example with you before. You have a consensual experience. It starts totally consensually. Someone starts choking you in the middle. You communicate, I'm not cool with that. They stop doing it. You go back to having consensual sex. You leave happy. You like that person. Were you just sexually assaulted because something happened that you didn't consent to, right? The language of consent is not sufficient to deal with an activity like sex. It's necessary, but not sufficient, right? It doesn't do the whole job. Because look at things I hate describing sex acts, but there's no way around it when you're talking about sex. But a lot of young people, they're having sex. Maybe someone slips a finger in somewhere without asking. If they did ask, the person might have said no, but they didn't ask and they put a finger in and they love it. And it's amazing. And they never would have known that that was something that they really liked if it had been this whole conversation beforehand. So a lot of especially early sex is criminalized if we only use the language of consent. But if you build in ideas like respect, reciprocity, autonomy, then you actually safeguard for a lot of this. And this when we talk about, you just said, you basically used ideas that are already very prevalent in sex positive communities. The idea of expressing boundaries before an act, the idea of having an aftercare conversation, and respecting boundaries that you agree to before the fact, that you agree to regardless of if someone changes their mind in the moment, right? So it doesn't matter if you're so we'll use choking because that's what we've been using. If you say as a boundary beforehand, no choking, and then in the moment you're like, I changed my mind, fucking choke me, choke me, choke me. No, you don't do it, right? You can talk about it later, aftercare, but that boundaries need to be respected and agreed upon for the safety of both parties, because you don't want that situation where afterwards someone feels really shit about what happened and they're like, I told you I wasn't cool with choking. Why would you do that? So and someone in the chat brought up something really interesting too. It's consent has a lot of nonverbal cues. And that's why I often talk about respect and reciprocity, because if you're paying attention to your partner, if you're actually engaged in your partner, if that's actually something that you're doing together, then whether they're consenting or not a lot of the time. I mean, obviously early interactions, trying something new, verbal consent is incredibly important. But long-term partners, etc., if you are focusing on respect and reciprocity and you are appreciating and considering the person you're engaging with as an individual human being, then that's a pretty good way to safeguard against things.
Agreed. Fantastic there. And then moving back to the point of pleasure, which was the heart of this, right? Which we've bounced around all kinds of subjects, but it's really tough to seem to focus on that, because there isn't much language to use, right? To talk about sex that was meh, right? It wasn't bad, it wasn't extraordinary, but it wasn't what you wanted, right? You wanted more from your partner, but you don't know how to tell them that. You don't know. And you don't know, maybe in the grounds, in what setting can I tell them that, well, this was good, right? Or I enjoyed being with you, right? But what we did was not great. I think we could do better, right? And having the understanding, right? The comfortability, the ability to acknowledge that, okay, my partner is telling me that our interaction wasn't all that it was. This actually has less to do with me and more to do with just the things that a partner would want, right? My partner is trying to relate something to me about what they want. It's not necessarily that of my lacking ability, right? But it's not how we talk about within our society, especially
Yeah.
when it comes to men. Yeah, like that men have I failed. Like she didn't
Well, I mean, and this is again why I resist legal, pathological, and moral language in this field, because like if you make it like a moral thing, it's like you have failed and you have done a great wrong by not, behaving the way you were supposed to, or you're sick and dysfunctional because you like certain things, or you basically just assaulted me. That was assault, right? Like, this is a highly intimate act that requires a lot of trust and a lot of communication, and those three tendencies immediately shut down communication immediately, because it's such a heavier thing than what the actual act is. This is already, as it's about normalizing behavior that is already prevalent in sex positive communities. So opening up channels of communication around sex between people you're having sex with outside of the actual act itself, right? It's like not waiting to communicate things when you're doing it, like talking about it before and after. But I think, yeah, I think it's always, and that's the other, like, that's why I resist like legalizing and pathologizing too, is because you're going to have a lot of bad experiences. That's just normal. Even bad experiences with people you end up having great experiences with, or have had great experiences with in the past. Like, that's just a part. Like, it's not going to be great every time. It's not like after each encounter you're like giving someone a feedback card. And it comes down to, as you said, like in society, men are promoted to sort of focus on their own performance and their own experience. And so like pushing outside of consent and me being like, yeah, cool, I got the check, I'm good to go, I'll go back to focusing on me now. It's like pushing the idea of like, this is something that two people are in. That's another human being who has their own wants and desires. And out of respect for them, I've got to make sure that I'm aware of those. And out of reciprocity, if I'm having a great time, I need to make sure they are having a great time too.
to expand on that because the way um and this is not your attention, I'm sure, but the way that that was discussed and the way we've been discussing in general is in the context like of a relationship, right? Like at least that's if I was hearing this, I would hear this sounds like a committed relationship to me, where like you said, like well, this requires a lot of trust between two individuals, but there's a lot more other sexual interactions that happen where that trust is not there. It's two people come together to do an act, right? To maybe find pleasure, or one person find pleasure and the other person there for monetary reciprocity, I guess, right? So, like, how do we talk about those acts, right? Because those acts can unfold in a myriad of different ways. And like there may not be an aftercare, right? There may not be all these uh, uh, moments in time that we usually assume that two people have because they're within a relationship, right? To understand each other. But they're going to do this act any which way, right? And
Well, if you're not seeing someone again, the aftercare with that person is not necessarily all that important. I mean, I think individuals can still check in and with themselves and be like, well, how was that for me? I mean, I don't know. I personally push back on that. I think if you are having sex with someone who has a good attitude about sex and has 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 a has a good attitude about sex, then communication before the act to some degree, and aftercare after is standard. Like, aftercare sounds so formal, like BDSM-y, but like I'm like it could be pillow talk just about sex, right? So like I just think I think it's important to talk about boundaries and experiences and open up. Like, you know what? It's like an individual project almost, that we need to move from like more sex positive spaces into more normative spaces, which is like just talking about sex outside of sex without being like,
yeah, yeah,
right? Like, or being like, damn, I want to fuck. Like, having more conversations about sex itself, and like, I think it just makes for better sex. And that is true if it's with someone that you want to be with for a long time, or with someone you want to be with for a night, or with 8 people you want to be with forever. I don't know.
yeah, yeah. I'm thinking of conversations I've well, encounters that I've had with sex workers and ones I've seen online, right? And all of their experiences, right? And trying to relate that back to everything else and the language that we use. And I feel like we don't have, as you've gone on again and again about like, we don't have ways to properly describe what those interactions should look like and how they actually unfold. We only have it in terms of like, oh, well, you're a couple, and these are things that are happened. But like the needs of people who, and you could take it out of sex work, right? You could talk just one night stands, right? The needs of two or more people who engage in that, right? Engage in that specific act, right? They look a lot different, and pleasure, right, may not come, for instance, from that emotional connection, right? So many people think like I need that emotional connection, and to say that that's okay, right? So like you can find pleasure on another axis without that, and it's fine if you do. Um, yeah, mm. Yeah,
But that's like, see, that's just the broader conversation that needs to happen, right? Like
yeah.
doing a conceptual analysis of like, what is good sex? Like at its very base, like what can we universalize? What generally makes for better sex for everyone? And I mean, like, I think I feel like we went consent and we were like, perfect, we got it. That's it. That's the concept. Great sex equals consensual sex, done. And I'm just saying that we need to flesh out what it is a little bit more. And I think, you know, like we did a good job in the conversation earlier today. We did a good job in this conversation. And I think it's just like making conversations more mainstream without it descending into discussions of trauma, discussions of consent, or discussions of individual singular sexual experiences.
Mm. What form would be the best for this? Right. So like in the perfect world, right? Like what like how would that happen? Like would we be teaching this in school? Would that be the form to do this, right? um, would we
I think
be
we I think, well, I don't know what American education is like, but
mm,
we sort of start to teach this here. But once again, we fall back on this like consent issue, right? So, like here in Australia, we have a big module in school called respectful relationships, and it extends outside of sex, right? It's just like how you should treat other people. But ultimately, it gets reduced down to like, if someone touches you and you don't want them to touch you, that's not okay. And it's very reductive. It always comes back to this when, like, I think there needs to be more on respect and communication. And actually, I think Maddie brought up a really good point, right? Like, you're not going to, it's difficult to have communication when shame continues to exist. You're going to continue to have shame exist so long as women can't express it. Like that's why women can't express their sexual desire. A huge part of this is that in all mainstream media, women are seen as something for sexual consumption, not for any sort of sexual output, or they're not the sexual agent who's doing the procuring of sex. They're the sexual object that is taken for sex. And I am talking in a super cis way. And there's like, actually, to be honest, taking it into like more queer spaces creates more answers to this. The reason that I focus on a heterosexual sexual encounter is because for me, this is like where the problems are at their very core most of the time. And so, like, so long as mainstream media presents women, for the most part, as objects for sexual consumption that have no agency, no desire, no autonomy, then it will be really difficult for women to feel comfortable expressing those things.
two things? One, for the most part, the your representation of media is correct, but as you know, sometimes like there is the temptress, right, or the more sexually aggressive woman, sexually
And she's
liberated woman,
evil.
and she's evil.
And she's
And
evil.
yeah, exactly that. And
So
she's
we're going to create shame. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. There's that, but I mean, I'm just saying it is changing. I see some, I guess, green shoots like out there, right? Like some. I see in media some growth in specifically this area, but uh, maybe I guess it's always through the lens of maybe hypersexuality. That's the way that's the way we can allow this, right? It's hypersexuality, but it's not discussing the women's sexuality in any other access, right? Like this is a woman, like, yeah, I am sex positive, I am liberated, and so I'm going to have sex, and so and I'm not looking at negative looked at in a negative manner in the course of this story, right? This narrative, but still, it's because I want a lot of sex, and we can't have any sort of discussion like any other woman. Then, like within that same narrative, who isn't hypersexual, their sexuality isn't
It's like
consent.
it's not about communicating women who are like, damn, I love to have a lot of sex. Like, that's great to have representation for that, sure. It's about having media representations of a woman who insists that she has an orgasm every time that she has sex, or that a certain thing that she wants is done. Like, I mean, like, I'm very critical of porn, but if you look at any sort of porn thread that is about men, it's usually about gay men, because why would women want to look at anything pornographic? If you look at lesbian porn, that's for gay men. So I mean, for straight men, it's not for women. And any sort of like sexualized thing, like any just base. I mean, look at even, the disproportionate view of how we view in the media and generally throughout society, the differences between a woman giving a blowjob and a man going down on a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is seen as disgusting and what is seen as expected. So I think I'm not necessarily trying to normalize the woman. Like, I mean, I'm totally am trying to normalize her, but I'm not talking about only normalizing the woman who's like, damn, I want to have a lot of sex. I'm talking about normalizing a woman who like wants to say that she likes something in the bedroom and isn't terrified that the dude is going to turn around and be like, well, fuck, I don't want to fuck then.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Um, so just harping on that for a second, like, and I guess I don't know if you would describe as internalized misogyny, but I think I might have brought this up to you before. Um, like, I certainly agree. I definitely agree that there are other parts of sex that are um, equally enjoyable, equally as valid to be to desire to want to participate in all of that. So like 110% on that. But I've seen and talked to women, right, who are like, um, who aren't even comfortable enough with their own bodies. So being, being,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And this is the thing though, right? Like, it's something that you hear a lot spoken about by women, which is that they're thinking about their partner when they're receiving pleasure.
Mhm.
So instead of focusing on themselves and what they want, they're like, oh, they probably like they've been down there for so long, and they get anxiety about like, having an orgasm, and it makes it like pretty much impossible. And they get self-conscious about their bodies, and because they're not used to desire. There's no liberation of desire. They're allowed to be consumed, blah blah blah, all of that, but actually wanting something and having a moment where it's focused purely on them, a sexual act that's focused purely on them, their desire and their experience, is extremely uncomfortable for many women.
I relating to that. So talk to women who how they relate to their bodies is through the lens of like what men want, right? So a woman talking about her vagina and saying like, well, no, that's ugly, right? And I asked like, why do you think that's ugly? And she says um, because all the guys I've talked to have said it's ugly, right? And these were like not American men, but like like within that culture, I guess they're just like, yeah, that's like an ugly thing. I mean, I'll have sex with it, but like, oh, ugh, right? And she was like, no. And I remember trying to have this conversation with her, saying like, well, that's not the case, right? Like, there's plenty of beauty we found in a woman's body, and she was just convinced. She thought it was the strangest thing that I was saying this. I thought it was amazing, but she was relating it to the lens of the men around her rather than like what she thought about herself and the female body, which I thought was really fascinating. But there's also what was that else I wrote down? You were talking about queer issues, right? And you saying like the problem is mostly in that you see is mostly in heterosexual relationships. But we know there are toxic or dangerous interactions that happen within queer spaces, within queer relationships. Some of them are because of I guess, an emulation. of uh, the heteronormative uh, uh, relationships,
But
right?
also, yeah, 100%, the attempt to like emulate heteronormative relationships, but it also pushed back on that because, like, in a lot of domestic violence issues, police will arrive at a queer domestic violence situation and they will assume that the more femme presenting or submissive presenting partner is the victim in all cases. So, like, it's not a surefire rule either.
No, well, exactly. Well, yeah, that's a larger conversation about domestic violence and like who does what. But as knowing that we don't have, but I guess it gets to the point we don't have the language or experience in our society, right? We don't have the mental conception of what it all the things that a queer relationship can be, right? And so it gets boiled down to, well, what does this look like? As I see in the media, or I see in terms of my community, and what's valued, right? What's valued is a marriage, right? So sticking within the concept of two individuals together, right? Within a marriage, it may be one person taking care of the other person, right? So all these things can be replicated and never really examined, even within those spaces, right? Like, should we agree?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is a bit of a different conversation, and that's why I didn't pick up. Johnny raised it earlier in regard to like gay marriage, and obviously, you know my feelings about marriage. But like, I think there is a huge point to how we need to change how society views relationships. But the reason that queer people often try to emulate heteronormative relationships is because they are normative. They're seen as normal. And a lot of queer people don't base their entire. There are some people who are queer through and through, through, through and through, through, through. So, like, not only is it their sexual identity, it's their community. It's not just who they're attracted to, it's the people they hang out with, it's the activities they take part in, et cetera, et cetera. But there are some people where their queerness ends literally at their sexual attraction. And they really don't want to be viewed as anything abnormal. They want to be viewed just like you. They're just attracted to someone else. And so the best way to do that is to emulate what is accepted as normal. And obviously, for middle-class white gay men, the biggest barrier between them and heteronormative society was the ability to get married. So even though it may not be the situation that impacts the queer community the greatest, it is the one barrier to the community that is otherwise pretty much the same.
No, this is great because I think it brings in the larger discussion about like what being gay, what being LGBT means and what should look like and how that should be presented to a society. This might be too large of a conversation to discuss,
Yeah.
but like, yeah. But just that, I won't keep you here forever for that. But just saying that, I remembering what the fight for marriage equality looked like here in the States. It was commercials where they were saying, well, we're just the same as you, we just love someone differently, right? And then juxtaposing that to the pride marches, right? And what that should like, what should be presented, right? And that being taken over by a corporate presence that has sort of redefined it and then made it more presentable, right, to a mainstream audience, or else we're not going to give you money and put our corporate stamp on these things. Rather than those other queer marches, right? Because there's like an alternative to like the Pride March, in which like kink is allowed, right, and celebrated, right, and sexuality in all its different manifestations are on display, and as I guess the discussion of whether that damages the larger community, but that's a larger thing. Sorry, I thought it was interesting. Sorry, never mind.
No, it is. It's
yeah.
It's such a big topic.
Yeah.
It's like 8 topics.
Yeah. But in any case, great. Is there anything else that you want to say on this? I wanted to.
No, I'm scared of that like mounting room.
Will you be joining us or?
I might grab something to eat and come back, but I'll listen. Okay. Well, yeah.
Okay, yeah. But I'm glad we could have a deeper discussion. We had like a misunderstanding, but I think our
I'm sorry I sort of called you an incel. I didn't mean to. That wasn't what I meant.
You mean when you wrote Prime Cell in the chat, that's not what you meant? Did you, is that not? We can scroll back up. I can look at your logs, you know, and see what you meant. Yeah, I'm gonna text them. It's okay.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Look, it's fine. Joe, I love you so much, and I'm so happy to have you as my friend. I love having these discussions with you. I've missed having these discussions with you, and it's so fun we can do this like one-on-one with other people, like interrupting us, which always happens on the open panel.
I know, yeah. Goddamn other people.
Other fucking people. Oh, right. Yeah, I guess I got to talk to them now. But it's just so much fun having these discussions and like digging in deep into these topics. And I appreciate your perspective on this because you have like such a deep knowledge in this particular area. And I think it's extremely valuable to my community, and it's valuable to me to learn about these things as well. And I do you ever get anything like the other way around? Like, do you ever learn anything from these, or do you find yourself when you're in these spaces just like being the expert?
100%, 100%. Because it's not even just about like, I resent. I mean, if I resent thinking that reading shit makes you an expert, especially in things that are social. I think there are technical skills where you can be an expert, like for instance, medicine or the law, but I don't work in those areas, and I predominantly work in philosophy, and anyone who tries to like philosophy own you is a fucking dickhead, because there shouldn't be conclusions. We're all grappling with things, and grappling with issues means that other people have just as much of a stake and just as much of an ability to have a new idea or a new way of looking at things as me. And I really enjoy people's input. And it also, if people disagree with me, it also helps me interrogate my own arguments, which aren't always correct. So I get a lot out of them.
Okay. So Joe, we can agree that no one does philosophy wrong. No one can...
Actually, you know what? If this panel, if your channel's taught me anything, people do philosophy wrong.
Okay.
But there's no way. People can do philosophy wrong, but there's no way to do philosophy right.
Okay. I guess I can accept that. All right. All right. I'll leave it there. All right, I'll leave it there. But thank you so much, Joe. And Joe, once again, we gotta shout Joe out. I'm gonna always shout Joe out because, and this is true, and I'll fight you on it, I'm Joe's #1 cheerleader, right? So take a look at the chat. You'll find links to her YouTube page, which is apparently blowing up, exploding, right? One video, right? And she's going to have an encore video. I know. I'm excited. Well, you're not excited as much as I am, but I am very much excited, and you should be excited too. So you should go and subscribe to Joe, right? And be there when she drops that next video. You're gonna know because I'm gonna fucking tell you. And then jump into her Twitch stream. She just had a great one last night, which I missed because unfortunately I was streaming at the same time. I'll go watch it later. But she's an amazing individual, and you'll love her too. So please go follow her. Great, thank you, Joe.
I would like to say that you pretty much stream from like 10 a.m. my time to 8 p.m. my time. So you make the time for me to stream when you're not streaming pretty much non-existent. And my next video is on it's a philosophical analysis of lying. I'm going to look at, of course, Immanuel Kant, Hannah Arendt and post-truth, and some Frankfurt on bullshit, and it will be super fun.
It's going to be amazing. It's going to be the fucking best. But anyway, talk to you later, good friend. Bye.